Hey everybody, I'm Nick Layton.
And I'm Leah Bottima.
And we're the hosts of Were You Raised by Wolves?
Each week we try to make the world a kinder, nicer place.
Well, that's the idea, at least.
I mean, we try.
Have you ever wondered what to do if you're ghosted?
Or what to do when a friend asks you to borrow money?
Or the proper way to eat Cheetos?
You know, the big questions.
So please find Were You Raised by Wolves wherever you listen.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
Today's program is brought to you by Korin, a supplier of Japanese chef knives and restaurant supplies. For more information, visit korin.com.
Hello to everyone. I'm Louisa Kasdan, your host for Let's Talk About Food, a podcast devoted to first-person storytelling where food plays a pivotal, if not a starring role. Everyone has a food story. Food is at the heart of human connection, at the center of love, of ritual, of need and want, and most of all, food creates community. And community is what we crave. Some people, rare people, have the knack of seeing the curves of the future and inviting the rest of us along on the journey. Greg Drescher, the Senior Advisor for Strategic Initiatives at the CIA, the Culinary Institute of America, is one of those people. A more insightful job title would be Culinary Visionary. Our conversation was fascinating as he traces his career arc from one peak to another. You'll enjoy the journey. Let's have a listen. I probably am going to use the words visionary quite a lot because you've been at the forefront of so many things that have started. I think I met you early in your tenure at the CIA, but you had already been part of American Institute of Food and Wine and Old Ways and so many other things that you had really been literally one of the key visionaries. And I'd like to know a little bit before I talk about all the amazing programs that you started through the CIA and allowed the CIA to offer them to so many different populations, not just chefs, including one that's near and dear to me, which is the program for physicians that David Eisenberg runs. But I'd like to find out why you, as a nice Midwestern boy, ended up doing this. Where did all that come from?
Oh, sure.
And you are a nice Midwestern boy.
Thank you. I grew up near Minneapolis, and I can trace a lot of this back to my family and my parents. My father was a physician, started what is now a major Mayo Clinic medical center in western Wisconsin, and his mother had been a reader and advocate of some early health food folks, and Adele Davis, if you know that name. On my mother's side, my grandfather was a baker, emigrated from Norway, and had a very successful bakery in northern Minnesota. And so we had great food in the house, but typically we'd have whole grain bread growing up. We had a huge garden, we had orchards, and so we had delicious food that was also healthy, and I never saw a big split between those two. I was lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time in Europe after high school, before college, and of course fell in love with European food culture. But what really kicked off my career was I was taking a break after college, and I was based in Santa Barbara, and was managing a cookware store, an early forerunner of Williams-Sonoma. And Julia Child at that point was wintering in Santa Barbara. And,
as one would.
And she was part of this group of people, along with Robert Mondavi and Jeremiah Tower and so forth, that started the American Institute of Wine and Food. And I was involved on a volunteer basis early on, but before I went back to Europe for yet another trip, I said, if you guys ever want to start conferences, I'd love to help you with that. And I was hired I became the associate director for the American Institute of Wine and Food for 6 years. Next year will be 40 years since I organized my first conference at what is now the Four Seasons Santa Barbara. And Julia Child, Jim Beard had just died, and there was many tributes to his role with American gastronomy, and that kind of kicked it all off.
Amazing. You were just a kid at that point. What were you? Were you even 30 when you were organizing all these conferences?
I was 30,
And did you have a sense of how powerful people like Julia Child and Robert Mondavi would be? There's a lot of star power that you just mentioned.
Oh, yeah, no, very much so. And anybody who was anybody in food and wine and the chef community in the 1980s was part of that organization. And it was amazing to meet all of them and work with them. The board was just full of really tremendous visionaries that were a part of shaping the landscape of food and wine and all things culinary that we have today. But I just had this idea of bringing people together around dialogues related to food, which continues to fascinate me. Julia was really motivated. As you may know, the impetus for starting the American Institute of Wine and Food was to preserve the Simone Lowenstein collection of books and really to win a place for gastronomy in academia. And Julia felt strongly that food deserved serious study, and that has been a big source of inspiration for me, certainly over the years.
And tell me about the collection she wanted to preserve, because I'm not familiar with that.
It was one of the great culinary. It was called the Simone Lowenstein collection. It was going to be broken up at auction. And so Julia called everybody she knew and said, we need to preserve this somewhere. I think it eventually went to the University of California, Santa Barbara. But if we want to win a future for the study of food and wine and gastronomy, books are a big piece of that. And we can't have these big collections that become available broken up. And that was really the inspiration for the American Institute of Wine and Food early on.
To raise the money to buy that collection, to endow it. I didn't know that's where it came from. So you started doing that, and then it went on for a bit, and your capacity to organize people to do interesting things accelerated. And then what was the next step?
So I've always had an interest in sustainability early on and food issues beyond great food and great wine. And in 1989, one of the last conferences that I organized for the American Institute of Wine and Food was a conference focused on sustainability in Chicago. I think it was the first major culinary conference ever focused on sustainability, environment.
What did sustainability mean at that point?
A lot of it was tied to the big ALAR incident with apples, and National Resource Defense Council was championing the need for better pesticide regulation and so forth. But it became a window into the larger issues related to sustainability. But we had 500 people for that conference at the Ritz-Carlton in Chicago, and it really kickstarted a lot of interest among chefs in terms of where their food came from and how it was raised and who was doing that. It had a big impact. But after that, then I decided with the then chairman of the board of the American Institute of Wine and Food, Don Gifford, and Nancy Jenkins, who was then the program director, I was the program director. She was the publications director. She had been at the New York Times, and the three of us then had this idea to create Old Ways Preservation Exchange Trust, which Don had already incorporated, but it hadn't been activated, and allowed us to really focus on areas of interest for the three of us.
And Old Ways, I have a very large warm spot in my heart for Old Ways. The goal of Old Ways, in addition to all of the perks that were the goal of Old Ways, the goal of Old Ways really was to connect chefs and journalists and ultimately to spread the gospel of keeping food traditions alive and celebrating them. Was that your vision at the time to do that, or?
Yeah, very much. And it was cultural discovery, but cultural discovery with a focus on preserving traditions. And we always talked about the institutional support for preserving old buildings and preserving paintings and preserving artwork in general, and that there wasn't really an organizational force to preserve the traditional ways of preparing food and dietary patterns around the world and flavor dynamics and all that. That's where it started. And then the health piece came along soon after that, but not initially.
And when you think back on your time in Old Ways, and you were with Old Ways for how many years?
Almost 5 years.
A foundational presence in it. What strikes you as some of the most fun or the most important things that you did as part of Old Ways?
The transformational event was a conference that I organized in Greece in 1991. That was originally, all of us had been very attracted to the Mediterranean, not to exclusion of the rest of the world, but Greece in particular had a lower reputation in terms of the quality of its food and wine at that time. Now people understand that there's great food and wine and culinary dietary traditions in Greece. But working with a group of growers and exporters and the government in Greece, I spent a year and a half planning this conference that was, I don't think it's been matched since, brought together the best cooks and chefs and bread bakers and cheese makers and so forth from all over Greece at the resort in the north of Greece. And one of the last speakers that I booked, working with a friend of mine, Aglaia Kremezi, who was a journalist at that time in Athens, was a noted health researcher, Antonia Trikopoulou, at the University of Athens, who came and spoke to the conference. And at this time, you have to remember that for American chefs that might have, and food people that might have been interested in health and wellness, the message was, fat is bad. You've got to get fat out of your diet. Everything else is okay, but the worst thing is fat. And she made a presentation at the conference that said, look, in Greece in the early 1960s, the Greeks had the highest adult life expectancy in the world. They had 90% less heart disease. They had a third of the cancer rates. And they were consuming 35 to 40% of their calories from fat. And we were all stunned in the audience hearing this. But after the conference, I had lunch with Antonia, and she said, if you want to pursue this, because I asked her, why don't we know about this? And she said, I'll tell you very simply. Nobody pays attention at that point to public health in the Mediterranean. That's all driven by Northern Europe and the United States. And secondarily, anything in academia that seems a little fuzzy or romantic, people run away from. And so when you think about the Mediterranean diet, in the north of Italy, there's a lot of cream and butter. In the south of Italy, there's more olive oil. In the North Africa side of the Mediterranean, not a lot of wine is consumed, or at least publicly. So there are all these variations. And so if it's not well defined, maybe we don't want this to wreck our career by embracing something that we don't really understand. But she said, if you want to pursue this, you should talk to my husband. So her husband at that time was the chair of epidemiology at Harvard, and they were not divorced or separated. It's just that she was working in Athens and he had been recruited come to Harvard. Yes, it happens. And I met with Demetrius, and he said, you should talk to the new chairman of the Department of Nutrition, who is Walter Willett. And that then led to an amazing conversation about Walter at that point was thinking that maybe the public health community had made a really big mistake by focusing on total fat versus saturated fat, which was really the issue that we should have been focusing on. And we just realized that maybe we could join forces and really do a serious study of all this. And that's where the early work that we did on the Mediterranean diet all came from.
Just sort of happenstance. You happened to be in Greece. She happened to come and give the talk. Her husband happened to be at Harvard with Walter Willett. And
I happened to be living in Boston at the time. So it was like a 20 minutes from where I was living. And so Walter and I and a small group, Marion Nessel was part of that early group. Marion, of course, who was such a legendary force in nutrition and trying to change food systems in the United States at NYU. One of her best friends was Elizabeth Helfing, who was the head of nutrition at WHO. So WHO came as a sponsor. Harvard, Old Ways, and we built basically a National Academy of Sciences type International Advisory Council, and the way that we viewed the evidence brought all these scientists together from around the world. There had been quite a bit of research. It just wasn't in the popular imagination in the United States, and it wasn't on the radar screen of the public health community. So anyway, long story short, we held an initial conference in Cambridge. I actually drew the initial Mediterranean diet pyramid, which then was circulated widely and critiqued. We then issued that formally as a draft, and then we had another international conference about a year and a half later, and that's when the Mediterranean Diet Pyramid was launched, and that just changed the course of nutrition and the public health community. But the other piece of the puzzle that I think really made a difference is that we were able then to run a whole series of conferences in the Mediterranean after this that got chefs and journalists and other food influencers over to really see firsthand, get into people's homes, get behind the scenes, and really experience what that was all about. So much of the food community in the United States in the past has been focused on France and Northern Europe. People may have vacationed in Greece, but they didn't think seriously about the food culture, Spain or Southern Italy and so forth. And so that was those two things together, I think, provided a lot of the early momentum around the Mediterranean.
That's incredible. It's the death knell for snack wells.
It was the death wells for snack wells. God bless. That was a dark period.
Wow. It's hard to overstate how significant an achievement this was. Because the Mediterranean diet pyramid, it hasn't gone away. Every year, some big study comes out that says the healthiest diet is the Mediterranean diet. There are others as well, but that's a building block, an accessible building block. And so you went, on the strength of that, you went from there to the CIA. Is that what you did next, or?
Yeah, I hadn't intended to work for the CIA.
It's not a big deal what you accomplished, Greg. It really is.
Yeah. I also want to say, look, there was a lot of people that did great work prior to that, and there was the Rockefeller-funded study, and of course Ansel Keys did the original 7-country study, but it hadn't bubbled up beyond a certain group of people that were aware of it, and this really blew the lid off the whole thing. But one of the things that we did with the conferences we organized, which we did in Morocco and Tunisia and Spain and Italy and Greece and Turkey and so forth over those years, is we always had a certain number of slots for different kinds of people, for chefs and for journalists and for academics, speakers that we brought over. And the CIA has long been the most influential culinary college in the United States, if not in the world. And we always wanted to make sure that we had 2 or 3 faculty members that could be invited. And so that was how I got to know the folks at the CIA. And then when they decided to open a campus in California, unbeknownst to me, I got a call one day saying, would you like to join the college and help head up education in the West Coast and bring some of the work that you've been doing to our organization? So that's how that happened.
Old Ways did an extraordinary job of creating a community out of each of those sectors, chefs, journalists, academicians. It's incredible. Do you feel that your programs at the CIA have been able to mobilize the same kind of, I want to call it interstellar community, but it isn't, bringing all of these different practitioners together?
No, very much. Old Ways still continues to do great work. It's still a small organization, and there are limitations with it, what you can do with a small organization. I think I founded a division of the CIA called Strategic Initiatives. We started with one conference, the Worlds of Flavor International Conference and Festival, that had a very simple idea, which was that as America started to really discover and embrace world cuisines more seriously, yes, you could go down to your local Thai restaurant or your favorite Cuban sandwich shop or whatever like that. But in many cases, to really understand those food cultures in depth, you had to reach back into the mother culture and bring chefs in. Right out of the gate, we started bringing chefs in from all over the world to make those cuisines more accessible to American chefs, and that had a big impact. But I then reached out after the first few years I'd been there to Harvard and to Walter Willett and others and said, let's bring some of this work that we did before to the food service industry, because there's such a huge potential for leadership in the food community. I had done a conference at Old Ways called Food Choices 2000 in the, I think it was 1992, that resulted in the founding of the Chefs Collaborative. I was very aware I've always been involved and engaged in helping chefs think about how they can build beyond their sort of culinary expertise and reputation and become a leader in food system transformation. And then we had the other issue that came up in the late 90s, which was some of those other issues around Pritica and other dietary patterns that just started to splinter. And so chefs would increasingly say, look, if I wanted to focus on health and if I want to try to make my menus healthier or offer more healthy choices, now I'm completely confused about the science. And so we had this idea of just partnering with Harvard on a number of issues and making that kind of expertise directly available to leaders in our industry, so they didn't have it filtered through the media and through other intermediaries, but they could ask questions directly. One of the first things we did was around trans fat, and a lot of very influential chefs and restaurateurs, restaurant owners just saying, I had no idea I'm going to get trans fat out of my operation. And so there were obviously many players that drove that initiative, but we were certainly happy to be one of them.
Well, I think when the trans fat research came about, no one that I knew had ever even heard of trans fats. It was such a technical term, and it came into the mainstream such that even on cookie packages now it says made with no trans fats. And when we come back, Greg Drescher will talk about how he helped awareness of the dangers of trans fat make it into the culinary and popular mainstream.
Today's program is brought to you by Korin, a supplier of Japanese chef knives and restaurant supplies. Korin is proud of their Japanese culture and traditions, but they want you to know that their products are not just for Japanese restaurants. Their knives and tableware bring out the best qualities of food from every culture and fit into every restaurant from French to Pan-Asian to American. And that is why they're located in New York City, where people from every country in the world come to eat. Korin's Tribeca showroom is home to the most extensive collection of Japanese chef knives in the world, including Japan. Stop by to view their exquisitely designed tableware and the rarest natural sharpening stones. They have a whole range of knife services from repair and rust removal to reshaping and realigning. Korin is dedicated to this ideal, bringing the highest quality Japanese design to your table so you can experience the unparalleled quality of Japanese craftsmanship in your home or restaurant. For more information, visit Korin.com.
And we are back with CIA's Greg Drescher. Does anybody know what a trans fat is? I have no idea. So that was pretty incredible. And I remember being at those conferences when the data was presented for the first time and everybody scratching their head about what are they talking about? What are these things? Because it's really an industrial or it's a chemical byproduct rather than a fat itself.
Yeah, it's a process. Exactly. That's how you get margarine. That's how you make liquid oils and turn them into a solid form. I think one of the mistakes that the public health community made going back prior to the 90s was this emphasis that a lot of these terms were too technical. And so that's why the focus initially was on total fat reduction, because we're never going to educate Americans about different types of fat. So let's push all fat down, and then with that, saturated fat will go down. And so that's how we got into that mess, because there was never research indicating that the total fat was an issue. But so then after that, that's why I think people then did focus on trans fat specifically. And also this is a maturing of the field of nutrition research, right? And people became more literate about some of these different things. But the Harvard partnership, one of the most important things that we developed with Harvard over the years was our Menus of Change leadership initiative. And that really grew out of I had many conversations with chefs going back 15 or so years ago, chefs of, let's say, large restaurant chains or restaurant groups. And they say, I get pulled into a meeting on nutrition on Tuesday, and I get pulled into a different meeting on sustainability on Thursday, and these people are not talking to each other. And from a menu development standpoint, from a culinary concept development standpoint, I think now looking back, it's pretty easy to see we need to look at all this stuff together, right? And the tagline that we came up for our Menus of Change conference series, which is now we're going into I think it's our 12th conference, is the business of healthy, sustainable, delicious food choices. And that really says it all. And I just talked about the integration of health and sustainability, but clearly, and this is one of the things that I think people love to partner with us around, is like, we can all agree that the food still has to taste good. But beyond the deliciousness piece, you have to be able to make money doing it, right? Or otherwise, it's not going to be viable. So you really have to look at all of those pieces of the puzzle.
I was indebted to you. I was at one of those early conferences, and somehow I just happened to be seated next to I think he was the executive chef of McDonald's, and we were talking about things. And he broke down for me something I, as a journalist, had never really understood. What it takes to make a change in a menu, in a formulation, when you're at the size of McDonald's. How long it takes to turn the Titanic around, what the supply chain issues are. I think that, for me, that was invaluable. I also think that through those conferences, and actually through all these conferences, you positioned the CIA as not just a cooking school, but as a resource for public information and for journalists about everything having to do with food that was complicated. And so I'm grateful to that, and I credit you with much of it. But I think that talking about the business of food with people for whom they're bounded on both sides, they have to make the food that people will buy, but they also want to make food that is safe and worthwhile to make. It's very complicated, and I think that's not well understood by the general community, by eaters in general.
One of the other things I think I spent a lot of time thinking about is the different segments of our industry. So the National Restaurant Association, which tracks total sales in the industry, So if you add up all the commercial restaurants, whether it's the individual, your favorite neighborhood restaurant or in one-off single restaurant, you add the chains in there, you add the non-commercial suppliers like Compass, Sodexo, Aramark that typically run corporate dining. You add in college universities and hospitals and all. You add it all away from home food, right? It's now exceeded $1 trillion in revenues. So if you are interested in food system transformation, if you're interested in better diets, if you're interested in more sustainable food choices, you have to pay attention to this sector. And one of the things that's most interesting is how they relate to each other and where you can get leverage for change. And some of these things need to be done at the same time. But going back to your conversation with the executive chef, who's actually Dan Kudrow, who is the global corporate chef for McDonald's and is a CI grad. And he said something interesting to me years ago. He said, everybody points their finger at McDonald's and says, you people need to change. But he said, we're not going to be the first ones to change. We're going to change. We're going to continue to innovate, but we're going to make bigger strides when we see successful innovation elsewhere in the industry. So that if your neighborhood restaurant or your K through 12 food service or college university, if they can't make some of this food viable, why do you think that McDonald's would be successful, right?
Fair point.
And so we've taken a very broad-based approach to working with, we have a Healthy Kids Collaborative. We work with the top school food service directors in the country to support them in a non-competitive, pre-competitive space, although they're not commercial, so their competition is really not the issue there, but be able to learn from some of the most progressive, innovative school districts in the country. Same thing, we have something called the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative, which is now with 70 universities, mostly independent, but some with Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass now as well, really pooling their thoughts, getting Harvard together with Yale and University of California and University of Michigan and all these different people sitting together and saying, here's what we're working on, here's where we've had success. That then builds not only success in that sector, but it builds the case for change elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a chain that's surging now, Cava, which is a very interesting case study, that wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't seen this change in other parts of the food sector. So that's something that we try to keep in mind as we go forward, is how do we help support change for the better in the industry as a whole by thinking about how the parts fit together.
Also strikes me that the University Collaborative is just such a perfect place to be able to start introducing young people, for many of them their first set of meals away from home, to different styles of eating and conscious choices that they make. I think that it's a perfect window for them. And when I go into Cava, I see who's eating at Cava. Yeah, it's great. Wow. And you keep on inventing. You're doing a million different things now. Where else are you?
One of the things that it's interesting to see how these things, when you go through your career and professional development, how things build on each other. And menus of change, we have 24 principles of healthy, sustainable menus, which if you want to do a complete audit of your operation and really say where are we on purchasing and menu development and operations, that's a pretty complete look at that. It's also a lot to get your arms wrapped around. So, God, 24 principles. Can I just focus on one or two things? And so one of the most important things, if you look at big picture, we pay a lot of attention to the Eat Lancet report that came out in 2019, which asked the question, in a world of 2050, when we're projected to have 9 to 10 billion people on the planet, how do we deliver optimal nutrition staying within planetary boundaries, right? What does that look like? And the biggest lift in all of that is the shift towards more plant-sourced foods, because you look at the impact on foods from animal sources in terms of water, in terms of climate and all of that. I think people are pretty familiar with that. But we live in a culture where, on a lot of issues, not to bring up politics, we tend to either want to be all in or all out, regular and unleaded. And not to take anything away from vegan chefs or vegetarian chefs, and there's a lot of great vegan and vegetarian food being produced in the country, and there's a lot of people who feel ethically that's where they want to be. For the larger opportunity, though, is for people to move into a space that you might call flexitarian, which is really the inspiration that you get from the traditional Mediterranean diet, or looking to Latin diets or West Africa or Asia, right? So the term plant-based, which has been around for a few years, tends to mean vegetarian or vegan. And so there was a lot of focus on plant-based meats and analogs and so forth. That's all fine. That's important. We need every tool in the toolkit. But the larger opportunity is to look at something we call plant-forward, which is a bigger tent. It welcomes omnivores that eat everything, but it asks you to make a bigger shift towards foods from plant sources without necessarily giving things up. And a lot of people are eating that way. It's like I might eat vegetarian on Tuesday and have a plate of ribs on Friday, right? So one of the most exciting partnerships that we have right now is with Google, actually. Google has one of the most impressive food programs in the country. They've been very innovative there in terms of not only delivering delicious food to their Googlers, but also food that's healthy and sustainable. And so we're very much aligned there, and they've supported a lot of our work. And so we're just coming to the conclusion of creating a plant-forward kitchen culinary training certification program to really immerse chefs that are already in the industry on how to really build flavor where it's largely focused on plant-sourced foods, not necessarily exclusively. Could be meat as a condiment in there, could be foods from animal sources in a reduced capacity, in a reduced role, but helping look at culinary technique through the lens of the plant kingdom, if you will, and let's throw in the mushroom kingdom as well, which is a different kingdom. And then that's level one. And then level two is really helping sous chefs, kitchen managers in larger operations understand the current state of nutrition science, the current state of sustainability science. And then we've got a series of modules. This is all online, on demand for chefs, that look at iconic recipes from around the world, right? So if you say, look, there's a huge opportunity around traditional food cultures as an inspiration for plant-forward cooking, it's okay, but how do I get my head wrapped around the entire world? And so what we've given them is a series of, I think it's around 75 recipes that are really iconic for the Mediterranean or West Africa or South America, what have you, that give you a sense of a window into the flavor dynamics.
Give me a couple
cultures.
of the icons.
I haven't seen that list for the longest time, but
It's
you can
rice
think
and beans
about
around the world?
No, or you can think about, there's a vegetable dish in Sichuan that's basically braised eggplant with a little bit of braised pork and Sichuan peppers, right? This is a traditional Sichuan sauce. It's basically a vegetable dish and very little meat there, not unlike Brussels sprouts where you might have a little
Bacon.
bit of bacon or something like that. Not to say that you have to do that in every case, but another one that comes to mind, I've spent quite a bit of time in Crete over the last few years in the southern Peloponnese, Messenia. You have what they call dakos, which is a whole grain barley rusk that's briefly soaked in water and then piled up with chopped tomatoes and a little bit of feta and olive oil and so forth. And it's really a wonderful salad sandwich kind of thing. And it's a great way to get whole grains. Absolutely delicious.
It's a beautiful dish.
Yeah. So there are many of these kinds of things that we can learn from around the world, but it's chefs are very busy. Once you get out of culinary school, it's just a lot to run a restaurant or to run a food operation. So we're trying to think about how can we bring these resources to chefs in a way that are already thinking, I need to transition my food, or my boss has asked me to develop more dishes in this direction. And unless you're very lucky or have some other opportunity, it's just hard for people to get away and spend weeks in Asia, weeks in the Mediterranean or Latin America learning these things. Yeah.
It's incredible. It's just incredible what you've done. And you're doing it not just out of California anymore. You're running these conferences all over the world at CIA sites all over the world now.
Yeah, we've started a Torre Mediterranean Center in Barcelona, which is in partnership with the University of Barcelona. And so one of the things that we've done in the last many years is develop very focused concentrations for our bachelor's program. So we have a Mediterranean concentration, and the students spend 15 weeks based in Barcelona and doing side trips out to southern Spain and Greece. We have a Japanese studies concentration where the students get immersed for a 10-day trip in Japan, in Tokyo and Kyoto and out in the countryside. And then we bring in a chef from the Tsuji School, one of the top culinary school in Japan, to teach alongside our chef in Hyde Park. We just launched an African cuisines concentration. We have a number of our grads that work in West Africa, Nigeria, and elsewhere in Africa. I mean, I remember 34 years ago reading Gourmet magazine. If there was an article about some other country, it was so exotic, and it was like, oh wow, an article on China or something like that. Now people expect to be connected around the world,
Right.
and so we try to make that easier for our students. The other thing I'll mention that's been a very significant development is the CI has added master's programs now. And so if you think about our work on sustainability, our work with Harvard, come to the CI and get a master's degree in sustainable food systems.
Do you have to be a chef?
Next year,
Is that a hands-on kind of program?
No.
That's a study program.
Yeah, and it's delivered largely online, and there's a couple of residential programs where you come for a week in California for an immersion experience and one in Hyde Park, but a lot of where the program is doing very well, and there's a real need with these companies to hire sustainability professionals that also understand food and culinary, and so that's filled a great gap. And you'd mentioned earlier our Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives program that we do with Harvard. And so we're now developing a culinary therapeutics master's program that'll launch next fall. So if you think about the future of healthcare, where you've got a physician that's a champion of food as medicine, and you may have a dietitian, the chef needs to fit into that framework with the ability to talk across disciplines and really understand the world of the physician, the world of the dietitian, the world of a mindfulness coach, and so forth. And so that we think will be a big part of advanced training and education for chefs in the future. Could be a program that a physician could take or an aspiring healthcare professional.
Well, as somebody who follows these things fairly closely, I've not heard of that, and I think it sounds great. I did not know that CIA was doing master's programs. That sounds fascinating to me. It sounds like there'd be a lot of interest.
Yeah, the CI is an amazing institution. It started in 1946, and initially it was the associate degree, and then before I came on board in 95, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, we added bachelor's degree programs. And then I think it's been about maybe 8 or 9 years that we started developing the master's program. So we also have a master's in food business, and with a track for if you're in the restaurant business or in the retail manufacturing business. We have an advanced culinary arts master's, and then the two that I mentioned. But yeah. Maybe not in my tenure, but at some point I'm sure we'll have PhD programs. It's just this is a very dynamic institution, and really looking at building for the future.
Yeah, it's a lot more than learning how to debone a chicken. That's for sure. So
No,
I always
exactly.
think of you as someone who has just the ability to intuit where food is going, where the culture is going. What are the winds of change that you're picking up these days?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything everywhere all at once. I'm incredibly gratified by the sort of deep embrace of world cuisines in the United States. I think that people care about, now I know these are slippery terms, authenticity, but chefs have become more concerned about doing their research and really understanding what these cuisines are, and then in many cases adapting those. And innovation is great, creativity is great, but in the case in the music business, some of the best jazz players learn classical music first, right? And so it's getting that foundation. But I think the biggest both threat and opportunity is embracing all of the great menu, food, flavor opportunities in the world of culinary arts, but then also how can I be a player and support imperatives in health and sustainability? There's a huge need there. And I think we're at a point where the scientific research, not only around the Mediterranean diet, but just in general in terms of what contributes to a healthy lifestyle, what contributes to a reduction in chronic disease risk and so forth. We have just so much evidence now, right? But what we need is more translation. We need more policies that work. We need more help. Even in the Mediterranean, unfortunately, a lot of people are moving away from the Mediterranean diet. So it's not just the U.S., but life expectancy is falling in this country. And then, of course, the environment. And so we have plenty of people that are warning us about all the bad stuff that's happening, but how can chefs be a source of not only joy and leadership, but a kind of source of expertise and culinary insight, culinary strategy that brings us all together, that basically says, I've got this. Just walk into this food experience. We talk a lot about this at our conferences and in our collaboratives. Yes, we want to educate people about the value of more plant-sourced foods or the value of foods that are more optimally nutritious, but at some point, people only want so much of that, or maybe
they want
not
the
at
joy,
all, and they
right.
just want it. They want the joy, right? They want somebody to do the hard work beforehand. They just want to walk into a fabulous food experience, right? I think that chefs can play a bigger and bigger role there. The other thing I would say is, I get asked this all the time. It's like, what's the vegetable of the year next year? Okay, I'm the wrong person to ask. But it's more interesting to look at the long arc of change. And some of these things just take a while. I go back to this conference I organized in Chicago in 1989 on sustainability. I mean, it was a lot of the same things, but we're making great progress. And I think that one of the things that's always important to understand about food service versus retail, and in the retail environment, a retailer can say, oh, here's some interesting new healthy, sustainable products, but I'll try them. And then if they catch on fire, we'll keep them and not. But I don't have to rebuild my whole concept, right? Whereas you go into a chain restaurant, or you go into even a successful independent restaurant, it's a lot harder to pilot things, right? It's a lot harder to change. It'll be interesting to see whether the legacy brands ultimately are able to really embrace some of these changes that are coming up, or whether it's going to be what somebody called the ankle biters recently to me, that will be the new players going forward. And of course, we've seen a lot of instances where Sears, Roebuck, or Kodak, or pick your company, that never adapted. But what I hope is that we can be helpful to the industry as a whole, so that we can grow as an industry and encourage innovation across the board, so that there's the least amount of financial pain and the most amount of innovation.
As always, Greg, fascinating to talk to you. You are miles ahead of most of us all the time, and you have been for the last 40, 50 years, and I appreciate that. It's just been great talking to you. Thank you. These are all wonderful things.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. This was wonderful. I can't wait to see what you do next. Thanks for listening. Let's Talk About Food is produced by The Food Voice. I'm producing, along with audio director and composer Mike Moss of Soundscape Boston. You can find more of our stories at our website, letstalkaboutfood.com, and on Heritage Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's Talk About Food is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.
Hi, listeners. We want to tell you about a podcast we're really digging. It's called Christopher Kimball's Milk Street Radio. Every week, they travel the world to find the most fascinating stories about food, including children who harvest cod tongues after school in Norway and a detective who tracks down food thieves. And on Milk Street Radio, you can always find the unexpected. The comedian who ranks apples using an elaborate 100-point system, the secret history of grocery stores, and how to eat your way through Italy. They also interview the most beloved names in food like Jacques Pepin, Sola Aweli, Jose Andres, Jet Tila, Ina Garten, Nigella Lawson, and Padma Lakshmi. Plus, co-hosts Christopher Kimball and Sarah Moulton do live calls with listeners and answer their questions about ingredients, techniques, and culinary mysteries. Like, why roasting a leg of lamb made one caller's oven explode? Ever wonder why your bread won't rise or your souffle falls flat? Chris and Sarah have the answers. You'll also hear from a rotating cast of contributors, including Kenji Lopez-Alt, Cheryl Day, Dan Pashman from The Sporkful, and Alex Ainuz, a French guy cooking from YouTube. Take a listen at 177milkstreet.com/radio or just search your podcast app for Milk Street Radio.